I do think that his ability to read the room has declined, and I think that's partly due to his advanced age. There are videos you can see of him signing executive orders where it's very clear he has no idea what he's signing, and even his responses are not on point.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, professor at Rochester Institute of Technology, and author of an array of books on Donald Trump. I mean, if anyone knows the mind of Donald Trump, it is you, David. So thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Glad to be here.
As I mentioned, few have covered Donald Trump as much as you have. What do you make of his first few weeks in office so far?
Well, what's different this time around is that Donald has a staff of people who are dedicated to completely changing the United States, to suppressing in a much more severe way people of color, Muslims, anybody who isn't a white, straight male like me. The first time around, Donald didn't have those folks, and Donald is a terrible manager. He presents himself as a businessman, but he's really a cash extractor. Every business I've ever been able to investigate, with one exception, a very small exception, he never had any money invested in them. He'd borrow all the money, like to buy a casino. He'd take a multi-million-dollar fee off the top, which gave him a negative investment. And then he would drive his executives and managers crazy because he would keep interfering in the business in non-business-like ways. And once the business was no longer valid and collapsed, he would say, "Oh, what a genius I am for getting out of the market."
And that brings me on to the current situation with what he's saying about Gaza. We've heard him say that the US is going to take over Gaza, but then we heard, Marco Rubio and also Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, they both appeared to row back on those claims, saying that if it did happen, Palestinians would be temporarily resettled. But then even now today, Trump has doubled down on his resettlement proposal. What do you make of this and this disconnect between Trump and then the rest of his team? And what does that speak to about his negotiation styles, that deal-making style he has?
Well, first off, let me point out that I've negotiated with Donald many times, and he's easy to get the better of. When he hired Tony Schwartz to write his book, The Art of the Deal, typically pay for that back then would have been $50,000. He said, "I want half the royalties." And Trump said, "Okay." And he's a terrible negotiator. He just claims he is. And when it comes to Gaza, Donald is appallingly ignorant, just appallingly ignorant. He couldn't tell you the difference between a Sunni and a Shia if he had to. Now, I don't expect most people listening to this to know, but if you're the president of the United States, it's really crucial to understand that difference in the Muslim world. What he is proposing is essentially a war crime. And many places have been raising this. And the countries in the Middle East have uniformly said, where is that from? We're not doing that. And this goes to Donald's belief that whatever he says makes it so. He creates his own reality. Or as another way to think about this, he lives in a fictional world in his head where whatever he says, well, that's the way it is, which is why he can turn around on a dime and say, "Well, I never said that."
It's been classed as this shock and awe approach that we've seen from Trump, and we've seen him do it with saying that he's going to apply tariffs to Mexico and Canada, which hasn't actually happened yet. That deal has been put off for the moment. But we did see Mexico, for example, they have started putting troops on the border in response to that. And on the other hand, people point out the fact that his threats about leaving NATO, for example, that's actually pushed NATO allies towards increasing defense spending. Don't you think there needs to be some credit given to him on that approach that he has? I mean, it's unconventional, it's unpredictable, but it is sometimes getting Trump what he wants.
Well, in the case of Mexico, he didn't get anything, nor Canada. I mean, that's been well reported here in the U.S., in Canada, and in Mexico, that Donald claims he got something, but he really didn't get anything in those deals. His threats against NATO are consistent with his belief that Vladimir Putin is a wonderful person who we should embrace. And as he said in 2018 in Helsinki, he didn't trust any of the American intelligence agencies, but he trusted Vladimir Putin. I don't know what more you would need to know to understand that Donald is utterly gullible and ill-informed.
And we've heard today that the Democrats, they've announced some sort of plan to try and impeach Trump for these comments that he made about Gaza. They're accusing him of advocating for ethnic cleansing. In Trump's last term in office, he was impeached twice. He's also the first convicted felon to be serving as a US president. And even still, despite those facts, the majority of Americans still voted for him to be the US president. Do you think the Democrats are sort of clutching at straws here? Is it going to have any impact whatsoever over Trump and his reputation?
Well, first, let me address his victory. He won less than half the vote. He only won by a margin of 1.5 percentage points. That's not a mandate. You want to see a mandate? Go back to Lyndon Baines Johnson in 64, Ronald Reagan in 84. He won by a very narrow margin, and he won principally because 13 million voters stayed home compared to the 2020 election. With population growth, there should have been 17 million more voters. Why do people stay home? Because they think the economy is doing well. And the American economy, as the magazine The Economist points out, is the marvel of the world. It's way better than anybody else coming out of the pandemic. And that's because of the policies Biden put in place to address these matters. So Donald benefits from the fact that the Democrats do not know how to communicate. The Republicans have had years and years of experience and training in how to say things in a way that viscerally touch people. The Democrats still speak in, well, blah, 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 blah. And by the way, footnote 47 on page 15 of my plan, they don't know how to connect with people. They've known this for a long time. And so they're being utterly ineffectual in opposing Trump. And there is not a single Republican on Capitol Hill who will vote to impeach Donald Trump.
As you mentioned, you've spoken to Donald Trump, you've spoken to him on the phone. You've mentioned to us before that he's a very skilled person at reading people. He's good at picking up on clues on what appeals to people. I mean, if we go back to the Washington plane crash and we heard Trump's comments about blaming DEI initiatives, even though there isn't any evidence to support those claims they made. So, I mean, those claims were criticized by many people. He's called insensitive. Do you still think that he has that ability to read people, read the room?
Well, Donald has a larger goal here. Donald really has a serious issue about people who are not like him, white, straight males. And so every opportunity he has to move the country in the direction of a white supremacist, white-dominated culture, he is going to take, partly to reach out to his base. I do think that his ability to read the room has declined, and I think that's partly due to his advanced age. There are videos you can see of him signing executive orders where it's very clear he has no idea what he's signing, and even his responses are not on point. But also, now that he's in a second term as president, he feels invincible. And of course, he has talked in the past and said that the only mistake he made as president the first time was leaving the White House. He still has designs on being America's dictator, as I've been warning people for almost 10 years.
What you just said there about how he doesn't like people outside of that white male construct. I mean, some might argue that that's quite an extreme description of Trump. We saw him in his last presidency. He didn't go to those extreme lengths as you're suggesting. What is it about Trump that's suggesting to you that he is going to those lengths? What evidence do we have for that?
Well, first of all, I have a long history with Donald Trump, 37 years of meeting with him and digging documents out of the public record about who he really is, and establishing that he's been a career criminal and the third generation head of a four-generation white-collar crime family. White-collar crime. We have a lot of white-collar crime families, and law enforcement principles haven't caught up with that. But Donald believes, and you can find many statements where he believes that, he's never done anything wrong in his life. He calls himself a Christian, but he's never asked God for forgiveness because he says he's never done anything that would require asking for forgiveness. And look what he's doing to the government right now. a group of young men who are not government employees are rummaging through and copying sensitive documents from the Treasury. They are in control now of the federal government system for paying all of its bills. These people aren't even government employees. And at the CIA, he has ordered that an email that is not encrypted be sent with the names of all the new hires. Now, not the full names, but if you're the Chinese or Iranian or Russian intelligence service, wow, what a gift. So he is behaving like someone who will never be held accountable.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about Trump's White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She's very young, she's very fiery. But what do you make of her?
I think there he's probably made a smart choice. The last time around, he was going to move the press corps out of the White House, which they might do, although they did not. And he's got someone who's telegenic and who's clearly talented at mixing it up with reporters. She's also reinforcing every time she comes out the fundamental principle that Donald has long espoused. You should not be allowed to criticize or write negatively about him unless he approves of what you say. And that's a very clear message that comes from her, that she is not there to serve the office of the president. She's there to serve Donald personally.
And it is interesting because in the first week of Trump being in office, it's reported that he spent nearly 8 hours on camera in his first week. And when you compare that to his first week in his first presidency, he spent about 4 hours on camera. I mean, this is a man who's publicly denounced journalists. Why do you think that he's giving so much more camera time this time?
Well, first of all, he's not doing all the work a normal president would do. Barack Obama, who wrote his own books, unlike Donald, used to complain to staff, why did you only give me a 2-page single-spaced memo? I need 10 pages on this. And he would stay up late in the night studying issues so he was informed. So he has the time to do things like this. But secondly, because of the way Donald was raised, with his very cold, depressed, and distant mother and a father who was a monster. I mean, he took a little bit of money from a neighbor boy and then said, that's my money now. Donald has an empty vessel. He does not know joy or contentment or love, and he never will. I refer to his life as a variation of the film Groundhog Day, the comedy. This is Groundhog Day, the nightmare. He is trapped in this world where he's a 13-year-old boy going through puberty, which you'll see in the comments he makes about women and how he talks about them. And he needs to have attention and money to feel somehow inside that he is okay. He knows perfectly well that he's not. And what a miserable life. I have people who will email me or call me and say, well, obviously, you're jealous of Donald. Oh, no, not in the least. What a miserable life to not, his family, commercial transactions, his wives, all three of them, commercial transactions. And a lot of people can't envision that, Joe. They what do you mean it's a commercial transaction? There are lots of commercial marriages in the world.
So Peter Mandelson, he's the new British ambassador to the US. He said that actually Trump is the antidote for disenchanted Americans who feel that the system has let them down. What do you make of those comments?
No, I think the ambassador is exactly right. I wrote a series of best-selling books, started while I was still an investigative reporter at the New York Times, on how the bottom 90% of Americans have been horribly damaged by the economic policies of the last half century. Their incomes have gone nowhere. In fact, in 2016, the take-home pay of 90% of Americans only covered the first 40 weeks of the year, 42 weeks of the year, compared to 1973. So the American economy has been turned into this system to stealthily take money from those below and move it up to the top. And in perfectly legal free lunch and the fine print, I document all of this. I spent years and years digging this out of the public record. And those were award-winning books that were used in some places as textbooks to explain what's happening. So absolutely, huge numbers of Americans are looking around saying, why was grandpa better off at my age than I am? Why was dad better off than I am at my age? Women have seen their wages rise against men, not because they're getting properly paid, but because men's wages have fallen. if you don't have a college diploma or an advanced degree. So absolutely, Donald speaks to these people and they feel he is their champion, but his policies he's putting in place are going to harm them. They're clearly going to go after Medicaid, which insures 1 in 5 Americans. They're probably going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And there are millions of Americans who believe that the Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are separate things. They're the same thing. And you can see interviews with people, well, no, I want to get rid of Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act, I desperately need that. They're going to get rid of that. They're going to stop negotiating drug prices and go back to $1,000 a month for insulin for diabetics, because this is a presidency of the rich, by the rich, for the rich.
That reminds me of the little tech billionaire bromance we're seeing at the moment of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. I mean, what do you think about that?
You've seen all sorts of business owners come to heel because the federal government has enormous power to mess with their businesses. Elon Musk, first thing he did with no authority was get the head of the FAA to resign, a forced resignation. Lo and behold, the FAA is investigating one of Elon Musk's companies. Elon Musk's wealth depends on his federal contracts. So here you have someone with $13 billion in federal contracts removing the people who have found that he's not in compliance with those contracts. And the Democrats can't even articulate that clearly to the public. His relationships with people always are one-sided. Elon Musk will be free to do whatever he wants until the day comes that Donald says, gee, he's too much in the public eye, or he did something that upsets me, and then that will come apart. But in the meantime, the damage to the American economy is already underway.
My final question is, we've obviously heard a lot from Trump in the last few weeks. He's been doing a lot, making a lot of changes to policy, implementing new policies. But what for you has been the standout moment or the biggest surprise for you?
Oh, I think the real problem is that they've made it clear they're going to fire several thousand FBI agents for doing their job. The FBI is in charge of counterintelligence. They have stopped numerous terrorist plots, some of which we have not heard about and will not hear about because it's not in the national security interest of the country. They've made it clear that anyone who did any work on the investigations of Donald Trump, that is, they came to work and were told, go check this out, go get that document, they're on a potential firing list. If you want to benefit President Xi's ambitions to replace the U.S. in the world, if you want to help Vladimir Putin or the Iranians for that matter, then that's what you would be doing. And Donald isn't working to help them, but that's the effect of what he is doing. And it's because Donald really believes he should never be held accountable. As I quoted him as saying, you shouldn't be allowed to write things about me that I don't approve of. That's not American. That's not British. That's Stalinistic.
Are you expecting a phone call from him anytime soon?
I doubt that Donald will call me again. He has said he hates me more than any other journalist in the world, which I understand because I spent years and years where he would say things and I would show they're not so. I showed how he was involved up to his eyeballs with one of the biggest drug traffickers in America and did favors that, especially as a casino owner, should have cost him his license. And that only makes sense if he and the drug trafficker were in business together. And they resumed their business relationship after the very short prison stint of the drug trafficker, whose case was somehow moved to the court of Donald Trump's sister.
David, it is always a pleasure to have you on Times Radio. Thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Joe, thank you for having me.